So my name is Fred Strebe, and it's my honor to be here today and welcome you. Okay, thank you. Oh, thank you, David. So you know, that was David Greenberg who started that very generously. Thank you, David. So it's so good to see you all here. It's my pleasure to welcome you. It's April 2nd, 2023. This is a series of panels in Brantford College at Yale. And the theme, as you all know, of today's panel is working towards the best in journalism. The genesis of today's panel is much more precise than that. It's the newest major honor received by the new journal at Yale, which is to be named this year by the Society of Professional Journalists, America's Best Student Magazine. And the room is full of the people who over years have made that possible. I want to say this is not a one-off victory for the new journal. The new journal, the Society of Professional Journalists, holds every year a competition. The new journal is in the Northeast region, which is the Ivy League, and comprises the entire Ivy League and much more. And the new journal won best in the Northeast, thus best in the Ivy League, with awards in the summer of 2014, the summer of 2015, and now the summer of 2022. So that's sweeping the Ivy League 3 years out of the last 10, and now culminating in this national championship. So you are dealing with a publication that really has a trajectory towards greatness. Thank you all for being here. So what brings me here, the reason I'm allowed to announce is in Neela Banerjee's year, which is also the year of Richard Bradley. Are you here in the room of Worth Magazine? Richard is an editor at Worth Magazine. Also the year of Ann Applebaum, who could not be with us. I was asked to join the board, and I was given a task, and I don't think anyone knows how explicit the task was. I was told to read every issue. From then on, from 1995 on, and for each issue, comment on what could be done better. Or not even that, how to raise the aspirations of a publication. And I can't imagine a more wonderful task than to have watched your great magazine year after year after year, achieving at such a high level time and again. So I just thank you for that chance. And that's this notion of commentary designed to raise aspirations. That's really why we're here today. It's to imagine raising the aspirations of journalism generally, in the nation. It's one of the reasons why we're very pleased to be doing a recording, which will make this available. This is very much in the current Yale spirit, which is that the value of what's achieved at Yale be accessible beyond the mere walls and moats and gates of this campus. So this is aimed to be aspiration for others everywhere. Also, there will be students during the course of the day who are from the Yale Daily News, who are here from the Yale Herald, who are here from the Yale Globalist. So this is partly for them. This is not a limited new journal celebration. So this is the goal of today's panels. Each panel comprises professional journalists who in past years were undergraduates working at the new journal. Each panel is moderated by current editors of the new journal, here flanking on left and right today. And the goal is to depict and imagine paths forward. Paths forward in a profession that can continue working towards being the best in journalism and in any publication anywhere in the world. Now, there's a lot that could be said, and I'm going to stop now. It's just time to stop. There are faculty members here who have helped generate this excellence. There are a community all around us. More people will be joining us online, but now is not the time for that. There will be time later, including in the late session that is called Roasts and Toasts and is subtitled, I like this subtitle, "You call this the best in the country?" And Dan Jurgen has agreed to be the final speaker. Dan Jurgen, who founded this magazine in 1967, who is here. Anyway, now is the time for me to introduce the moderators of our first panel. This will be Jesse Goodman and Nicole Dirks. And that's it, folks. Thank you so much.
Hello?
That seems a little more on. It seems more on.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll talk loud. All right. Well, welcome everybody to T&J Fest, celebrating the best in journalism. Thank you all for being here. As Fred said, we're here to celebrate winning the best student magazine in the country in 2022. But more than that, I think we're here to celebrate the incredible accomplishments and hard work of our alumni. And thank you all for coming here, many from far away. So passing it off to Nicole, she'll tell us a little bit about who we have here and how this panel is going to work.
Yeah, Jesse and I are really psyched to be moderating this panel about breaking beyond campus, aptly named, and into the professional spheres of journalism. As far as we know, there's no one way to carve out a career in journalism, which is both incredibly exciting but also sort of daunting. And in college, there's student publications that provide a kind of training ground for figuring out what journalism is, how to do it, and what kind you might want to do. Hard to believe that for everyone here at this table, T&J was part of that. So from where we sit here as students, still with our T&J training wheels, entering into that professional realm feels a bit like jumping off a cliff. And yet all of you have managed that in such unique and inspiring ways. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll introduce who we have. Sitting to my left is Maya Averbuch. She is the economy and government reporter in Mexico at Bloomberg. We've got Neela Banerjee, supervising climate editor at NPR, and Haley Cohen Gilliland, formerly at The Economist with writing in the National Geographic and the New York Times, and our Yale Journalism Initiative director.
And next to Haley is Elena Saavedra Buckley, an associate editor at Harper's Magazine and The Drift. And then we have Julia Preston, a reporter at the Marshall Project, and before that, you spent 2 decades at the Times. And then we have Ray Lipstein, a web editor at The New Yorker.
So just moving down the line, we'd like to hear a little bit about your careers, breaking beyond campus, and we'll go one by one, and then we'll hand it over to Ray, who will ask the first question, and then open up to the audience. So Maya, Nicole.
Yeah, Maya, for a panel about breaking beyond campus journalism, you seem like a great place to start because you sort of broke out in a big way after graduating. In 2016, you went to report in Mexico on asylum seekers and migrants, among other things. And then a few years in, that work landed you on the front page of both the Washington Post and the New York Times, very close to each other. And now you're at Bloomberg covering economy and government in Mexico. So can you tell us a little bit about that career jump, how it happened, and how you've developed since that moment in the national spotlight?
Sure, thanks everyone for organizing this event. I'm very happy to be back. I haven't been back to campus, I think, since I graduated. And so this is a very fun way to return. I will say, I think a lot of journalism is being in the right place at the right time, and even if that is an accident of circumstance, then going to editors and pitching yourself as someone who knows how to be in the right place at the right time, even if you didn't intend to be in the center of news. And that's probably especially true of freelancing. So when I graduated, requested a Parker Hwang Fellowship, which covered a year of my expenses, and had decided to write about asylum and immigration, and to do that in southern Mexico, and to think about the ways in which people from Central America especially were going into an asylum system that wasn't originally designed for the kinds of violences they were fleeing from, and how difficult that was for then thousands and thousands of people who were increasingly showing up on the US-Mexico border, but choosing a slightly easier place to report that than, say, El Salvador, where Sarah Maslin, who also had the same fellowship a few years before, had gone, and slightly easier perhaps than some of the more violent states in northern Mexico. And so chose a starting point that to me was interesting because I had taken a law class here with a very wonderful professor who taught us about the history of asylum law, and then wanted to make that kind of into more of a storytelling for myself and to try to understand it better. But with very little prior experience, which is where I think that a lot of the grants that Yale has come into play, because they give you a lot of time to make a lot of mistakes. Among the many mistakes I made were not publishing much in the first year, writing 5,000-word articles that I thought were very beautiful and not finding a place to get them published because nobody knew who I was. I think following people to places that were maybe somewhat riskier than I had originally known. But that was a gift, right? There was a period of time, I think, when I was trying to understand the way other journalists worked and understand the way some nonprofits worked or shelters worked, and took the time with that funding to follow people around, so that when Trump eventually was elected president and decided that immigration was going to be the flashpoints of his presidency, I went to editors and said, this is something that I have been working on for the past year. Will you let me write for you about it? And first all of them said no, or just didn't reply. So I think sometimes it's disheartening. And then you just, continue to try to report your stories as best you can. And so in my case, a lot of my early breaks came from covering the migrant caravans that went through Mexico that involved thousands of people, because I knew about them before other people did. And arguably they wouldn't have been a news event if the news wasn't there, if they had not reached Fox News, and then because of that, Trump responded, and then it became a question not only of something happening in Mexico, but related to US politics, which in the end is a large part of international news, for better or for worse. And so much of my early reporting was just being a stringer, contributing quotes, and building off of that, then being able to say, let me write an analysis piece, let me write a more narrative piece for different publications. And I think you take every little publication and then go back to editors you've met before and say, please give me a shot. I've already now managed to do this somewhere else. And if you didn't do it that well, hopefully nobody will rat you out the first time. And I would also say I had a lot of help. I think before I left, I asked Haley for help, I asked Julia for help, and I collected contacts and made an Excel spreadsheet of anyone who could possibly help me in Mexico and color-coded it to try to figure out who agreed to have coffee with me and who didn't. And people I met realized I really didn't know I was doing, and that turned into a joke. People would say, do you know what state you're in? Do you know what part of the country you're in? And many of those people were the most helpful down the long line and remain my friends many years later, whether they were already working journalists or whether they were people who were working in the immigration space. And now I obviously have a very different job. I think the other part of journalism is just making sure everyone knows who you are so that when jobs open up, whether it's to do one story or a longer-term job, that they already know who you are, because they're not actually going to do vast search processes as we might think they do. And so I ended up working at Bloomberg because they needed someone to cover the president, because he gives a 3-hour press conference every day. And so they did not have the staff to cover that. And so I went from covering immigration for about 4 years as a freelancer for all kinds of different publications to covering government and that vast thing called the economy that I'm still learning about. And so I think all of this seems to me like happenstance. I do think that Yale has a lot of resources and that people should take grants and try to go where they imagined they might go, and then just learn from the experience of others once they're there, and not lose heart with the pitching process. I once read online that somebody said that she bought herself a pair of shoes every time she sent 100 pitches, even if the 100th was rejected. And I think there's a certain camaraderie, especially in freelance spaces, about the difficulty of getting your workplace. And in the end, you pivot, right? You might not write the longest of features. You might do short pieces. You might do analysis. You might do a book one day. But those are all different little components of what you might end up publishing.
Thank you, Maya. So Neela, you are the supervising climate editor at NPR and an accomplished climate journalist for publications like the New York Times and the LA Times. And your work investigating Exxon was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. But you haven't always been a climate reporter. So I was just curious sort of about your path after you graduated college and how you came to find your niche.
Yeah, it took me, can you guys hear me? It took quite a while. By the time I decided that I wanted to be an investigative reporter who looked at climate and that I wanted to leave the big media companies I've been working for. I started my career at the Wall Street Journal, then went on to the New York Times. I was 50, and I decided that I didn't want to work for big media anymore. I wanted to work at a place that was going to let me do the kind of journalism I was happy to get up to do every morning. And they're the ones who gave me the opportunity at Inside Climate News to look into fossil fuel companies and what they knew when about climate change, and that's why this whole Exxon New thing exists. And so my career, though, was, it was also started overseas. It was far more random. It was a much longer time ago. But it's interesting to see how with you and with a lot of people who work at NPR, including people we've hired recently for climate, that people's careers can often start in being in places where you're lucky to be, but also in having particular gifts and skills, right? For example, language. So my career started as an intern at the Moscow bureau of the Wall Street Journal, and it was very loosey-goosey. There was like no internship program. I just spoke Russian. They're like, here, come. And so I showed up, and it was just me and my bureau chief because nobody else was there. It was the summer of 1991, and about a month later, the coup occurred. And so he was, in the office, like watching the coup plotters on TV sweating, and I was out in the street watching whatever was happening. And so from there, I worked for the Wall Street Journal for a time, back in the States, back in Russia. I left the journal and freelanced in Russia for a time. I got hired by the New York Times as a stringer for their business section, then got hired on staff in 2000. And also, Putin became president, and I was like, Russia's dalliance with democracy is over. I got to get out of here. And so I was with the New York Times for a long time, and basically when I was in Russia, because when you're a national or a foreign correspondent in a region or a country, you're expected to cover everything, including the economy. And oil and gas are big deals in Russia. They still are. They're still fueling the war machine there. And so I came to know things about oil and gas coverage that I didn't really know out the gate. I was an English major here, so anything I've learned about business reporting, I've learned as a journalist. And the great thing is that, you ask people dumb questions, and in my career, I can count on one hand the times people made me feel bad for asking dumb questions. People, whether they're economists or people in business or scientists, people are happy to talk about what they do for a living. And so I learned, and then I came over, when I was at the New York Times, I came over to the business section, and I was an energy reporter. And this was around the time that George Bush was president, and making changes to climate laws and environmental laws, and at a time when public recognition of climate change was also growing. So I became interested in that too. And then finally what happened was, in 2008, I took a buyout from the New York Times to remain in Washington, where my family was, because I couldn't move to New York. And so a few years later, I got a job at the LA Times as their environment reporter. And that's when I understood that the way to report on Washington is through an investigative lens. And what I was doing was the EPA and various federal agencies, and my editor wasn't interested in me being an investigative reporter. He just wanted me to say, be the first one to say if Keystone XL was going to get canceled or something. And so I was looking for something different, and that's how I ended up at Inside Climate. That's how I ended up doing the work there. And then when this opportunity at NPR came along, I applied. It was a brand new job that they'd created because NPR had covered climate mainly as a science story, and they were a little bit late to recognize that climate permeates all aspects of our lives, from culture to national security to food, to politics to misinformation. And so they created that position, and from there, we've now, also late to the game, created a climate desk where I run the editorial policy. And that's, sometimes you look back on your career, you're like, how did I end up here? But then things happen and you're like, oh, well, because I covered faith, for example, at the New York Times, or because I was in Iraq, or you understand that it brings so much more context and understanding to something that is happening both on your beat, but also in your publication. And when you're in management at your publication, you can weigh in on those things in a way that you might not be able to as a reporter. So anyway, that's my answer. Right? I'm happy to talk about more later.
Thank you so much, Neela. Haley, as YJI director, you're someone who sort of professionally helps people break out beyond campus journalism. Speaking from personal experience, you've helped me a couple times already. But in your own work, you've, unlike Neela, who specialized in climate journalism, you've sort of written very widely across like news desks as well as corners of the world. But you don't necessarily see yourself as a journalist. You've sort of described your interest as you like writing about people who are consumed by obsession. So I would just love to hear about how you came to like understand the kind of journalism you wanted to do.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to the New Journal staff for putting this on. This is amazing to see so many alumni and professors and the founder of the magazine in the audience. It's really special. Yes, so I think I have always been kind of constitutionally unable to focus on one topic. I've always loved nonfiction writing. That has become very clear to me and became much clearer to me here at Yale, thanks to Fred Strebe's class and Ann Fadiman's class and working on the New Journal. But when it came to picking a area of specialization, I just couldn't do it. And if you look at my transcript in college, it is wild. I mean, I took classes on underwater archaeology, which, if that still exists, everyone should take that class. It was awesome. Lucid dreaming in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. And really the only thread that you could possibly draw through my transcript was a love for writing. And so, it was pretty clear to me, especially after 4 years here, that was a passion I really wanted to pursue. And I think the amazing thing about journalism is that it gives you the license to explore your curiosities and not have to focus. There are, as Nicole pointed out, many different pathways into journalism. There are many different ways to do it as well. So, certainly there are journalists who are very specialized in one area, and that is of huge value to the industry and the world. That has not been my particular path. I have snaked a lot. So my career, or the way that I broke out of campus journalism, my first job after college was actually something that I found by just cold emailing authors that I really admired, and asking if they needed research assistance or fact-checking assistance on projects that they were working on. And I probably emailed 20 people, and about 3 got back to me, which felt like actually a pretty good yield. And the person that I ended up working for a summer after college was Steve Call, and I fact-checked his book on ExxonMobil. Great book. It was an amazing book. It was an incredible experience to work so closely with a master of the trade and really get into his process, get to read his interview transcripts and see how he structured interviews, see how he structured his research at a time when the internet existed. I'm not that old, but he mostly organized his book in an analog fashion, and just seeing how he did that, especially now that I'm trying to write my own book, was very inspirational. And he was also an incredible mentor, and I'm starting with him for a reason, because the fact that I worked for him sort of helped me launch in an unexpected way down the line. But I worked for him for about 6 months fact-checking that book, and then, like Maya, got a postgraduate fellowship from Yale to try to do foreign correspondence in Argentina. And my area of focus was a new media law that had been passed in the country that pitted the government against the country's biggest media conglomerate. And when I first got to the country, I placed a couple of small pieces here and there in pretty specialized publications about that media law. But my kind of bigger break, per se, came because of the help of Steve Call, who introduced me to an editor at Foreign Policy, who then published a piece that I wrote about Argentina's kind of increasing role as a transit hub for narco traffic. And if I'm being totally honest, that piece was a total bear to work on. I think I was getting paid like $200, and we went through 12 series of edits. It was miserable. I almost yanked it because it was very, very grueling. And thankfully I didn't, because when it was published, an Economist editor happened to see it, and the paper just happened to be looking for a correspondent in Argentina. And he reached out actually through Facebook Messenger, which was incredibly embarrassing because I had just graduated college. My profile picture, I think I had like a piece of seaweed as a mustache. Yeah, so that's one practical tip. As soon as you graduate college and you're on the job market, maybe check your social media profiles, make sure that they're in line with the image you want to project. This is certainly not, the typical Economist image, I would say. But in any case, he reached out and asked if I wanted to try out as the Economist stringer in Argentina. And I worked on the New Journal here. As I said, I took Ann and Fred's classes. My passion has always been narrative nonfiction. So The Economist was not, it's a brilliant magazine. That's not as much the work that they're dedicated to. So it wasn't a place that was even really on my radar, but I really jumped at the chance to get to report really regularly in Argentina. It's a weekly, and also stay in the country for longer. I had fallen in love with the place at that point, and so I tried out. Very luckily, it worked out, and I ended up staying in Argentina for 4 years, working for The Economist, having the most fun of my life. Getting to do a huge range of reporting from. I got to meet Pepe Mujica, who was the president of Uruguay at the time, and had taken kind of a vow of poverty. He was the president, but he lived in a tiny little one-room ranch house with his 3-legged dog, and I got to go interview him there, which was amazing. And I got to write a piece about the world's best polo player, Argentina polo, who was trying to clone all of his favorite horses. He succeeded. I wrote a piece for The Economist that was short, and then got to expand that into a feature for Vanity Fair. And that was very trippy. I mean, all of the horses, the clones would kind of pack together in the paddock, and they all had similar behaviors to each other. So like, there's a horse called Quartetera, and they would come up and like lick your face. And then the raptors were really grumpy, and they would stand in the corner and just like pin their ears back and leer at you. So that was so much fun. And yeah, after 4 years in Argentina, The Economist moved me to London briefly, and then to Los Angeles, where I was covering the American West, so the 13 states west of Texas, which was really fun. And once again, I mean, reporting for a weekly magazine where you're expected to produce a piece every week, just allowed me to have incredible reporting experiences, and I loved it. But the itch that was sparked here to write in a more narrative form, still nonfiction, but really trying to tell stories, that itch really never went away. And so after 7 years at The Economist and a lot of thought and anguish, I decided to quit and go freelance. And it was a really hard decision. It was a decision that, in full transparency, I think I could make because of having the privilege of, at that point I was married, my husband had a stable salary, I could go on his insurance. So it wasn't as big of a risk as, if I had been going it alone. And yeah, decided that to dedicate myself to narrative nonfiction in the way that I really wanted to, it had to be full-time. I couldn't try to kind of squeeze it in on the side of an Economist staff job. So yeah, I spent 3 years freelancing, trying to place features in different places. Had a lot of really fun experiences, which are, Nicole alluded to. I think the only thread that I can draw through them is that I tend to be drawn to obsessive people because, and I think this was a lesson I learned in Anne's class, but they tend to be the most colorful types of people to write about. So I wrote about, for instance, support group for shark attack survivors. There are very few shark attack survivors in the world because there are very few shark attacks. But there's a group of them, and they've named themselves the Bite Club. And I profiled actually a Yale alum who got attacked by a shark at a wedding in Mexico and was trying to, his obsession was overcoming his new fear, understandable fear of the ocean. And so I spent time with him as he tried to kind of work his way back into open water swimming. I wrote a piece for the New York Times about professional bass fishing, which is a thing, and it's very lucrative. You can read the piece to find out more about that. I wrote a piece for Bloomberg Businessweek about Ferdinand Marcos and these lawyers who have spent the past several decades trying to track down his pilfered fortune in order to compensate the victims that suffered under martial law. So it's a real kind of wide variety of subjects, and had a lot of fun. And yeah, at the same time, I'd always aspired to write a book. And so about a year ago, started working on a proposal that came out of my time in Argentina about these grandmothers who, during Argentina's last dictatorship, their grandkids were stolen from them by the military, who were trying to purge the country of anyone remotely left-leaning. The military's justification was that they would place them with military and police families that had the correct Argentine values, and kind of reprogram them, essentially. So this group of grandmothers banded together to try to find their stolen grandkids. And they're still at that work today. They've been doing it for 40 years. They've found about 130 of the 500 suspected stolen grandkids, and come up with new forms of DNA testing in the process. They're very, very enterprising. So the book is the story of one family's brutal separation and reunion as a way to tell the bigger story of these grandmothers. And yeah, while I was working on that proposal, Fred Strebe sent me a notice that the Yale Journalism Initiative was looking to replace their incredible director, Mark Oppenheimer, who was of huge help to, I'm sure, many of you in this room, certainly to me. And it was exactly the type of thing that I'd been looking for years while freelancing, to kind of do something of service, do something that would allow me to have a sense of team and community again. But I never in a million years thought I would get it. Kind of threw an application in. I thought about it, but I didn't ever think that it would work out. And then it did. So I'm now back at Yale, and this is my first year. It's been a complete joy, and a really nice compliment to working on a book, which is my passion. I love it. And hate it in equal measure, I would say, with equal depth. But it's very solitary work. And so coming here and going on walks with students and hearing, what they're working on and trying to work through problems with them has just been a total delight. So I think we're up to the present day. Yeah. As I said, snaky.
I'm from New York City. I don't think I've ever seen a fish outside of an aquarium in my life. But your piece on bass fishing competitions has taken over my YouTube algorithm. It's like all I watch. Yeah. So thanks for that. Moving on to Elena. So you graduated pretty recently, 5 years ago, in 2018, and you're now an associate editor at Harper's. But you had a bit of a different path than some of our other panelists. You started as an intern in Colorado at High Country News before rising to kind of an editing role in national literary publications like The Drift and Harper's. So I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit to the jump from regional coverage to your work now.
Yeah. Ditto, thank you both. And to Fred, I love emails from Fred. They're my favorite emails that I get from anybody, and so I'm happy that I got them for this. And so nice to see everybody here. Like Haley, I was also wanting to have a career in narrative long form, but it's hard to figure out how to do that in a financially stable way. And I also felt sort of a social tug between wanting to go be a correspondent by myself and wanting to be a part of a publication and be on a team and make work in the kind of scrappy, intimate way that we did at the New Journal. I think that was very formative for me in terms of what felt magical about that kind of work. I was also sort of a busted transcript girl, but I ended up taking a lot of classes about the American West and U.S.-Mexico relations, and wrote my thesis about a small town in New Mexico, which is the state where I'm from, that used to be a mining town and then turned into an anti-terrorism training facility, and had hired all the people who used to live there to be actors in these situations with Marines, which took a lot of long reporting and long interviews and many visits to this town. And I realized I wanted to keep reporting about the American West as a region. That's kind of the only way that I knew how to narrow my fairly generalist interests, because it's not only the place where I'm from, but a place where many, like anywhere, but a place where many conflicting histories intersect and conflicting types of law and governments. And I also realized that I wanted enough structure that I would have a job and income, but enough kind of freedom and trust from the people I worked with that I could work on longer projects. And it felt like the best way to do that was to go to a smaller publication and to scrappy feels like a helpful word, to kind of a scrappy one. I remember sitting in the Blue Dog Cafe with Annie Rosenthal when I realized that I should apply to High Country News, because they had a 6-month internship that usually then folded over into a fellowship after, and that felt like enough time to have a sense of what I was doing after college, and I got to be in an interesting place. So I applied there, got that, moved to a 5,000-person town in rural western Colorado called Gunnison, which is a beautiful town, and was an intern there for 6 months and then a fellow, and I was placed on the Indigenous Affairs desk, which was a great place to be placed. It was kind of a random placement, but ended up being a really good education and reporting on communities that I'm not a part of in a good, rigorous way, in reporting on really complex things like sovereignty and tribal law and resource management, and the federal government and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So I was doing sort of a few pieces a month that were mid-length for the magazine. And then because the team was small enough and trustworthy enough, and also we lived in a 5,000-person town, I got to know everyone very well. We all hung out with each other all the time. They kind of understood that I was interested in doing longer pieces, which was not really what interns did, but I ended up finding a story that worked well at a long length, which was about a funeral home in a nearby town that was under investigation by the FBI for allegedly selling bodies illegally, which is crazy. So I started reporting on that and found a really good central character named Debbie, who was kind of the leader of this ad hoc alleged victims group, and did the kind of reporting that I really loved, which was, I probably reported that story for like 6 months and just visited her and followed the case as it happened, and then wrote a cover story that felt really creatively fulfilling to me, and also was guided by a really talented editor that we had there. And then I wrote another feature story after that about a sacred shield that belonged to the Pueblo of Acoma, which is a Pueblo tribe in New Mexico that had been stolen from them and sold overseas at a Parisian auction house, and wrote a story about its journey back to the tribe and the sort of gaps in repatriation law that made it very difficult to get it back from across the border. And I think at the time, but especially in retrospect, it was so helpful to be at a smaller publication where I could do really rigorous, fun work, have enough time to do it, and be trusted to do it as a young person there. And those pieces got noticed by I got emailed by a Harper's editor after one of those at the time. So you don't have to be at the Times to be doing big, ambitious pieces. But I also didn't want to keep living in a 5,000 person town. It was beautiful, but I don't like skiing that much. So after the fellowship ended, I kind of weaseled my way into a contributing editor role. So I got some money every month, but I didn't have to keep living there. I didn't get to keep living there. I moved back to New Mexico for a bit and kind of hung out for a few months and edited for them. And then I moved to Texas for a bit, and then the pandemic happened, and I was sort of at sea. I didn't really know what I was doing. I was getting some money from this editing role, but part of scrappy magazines is they often don't have enough money to hire everyone they want, so they couldn't bring me on as a full-time person. And I applied to a ton of jobs and got really close with a lot of them. I was a finalist for a Harper's editor position back then in early 2020. And then in the midst of the pandemic, I moved to LA, and then this magazine called The Drift started and published its first issue. They had a sort of spicy editor's note that got a lot of attention, which brought it to my attention, but they were still really tiny and operating on a shoestring budget and not paying editors. It was just a volunteer staff. But I sort of like sniffed out a new journal vibe in them and wanted to have more companionship intellectually in my journalism life, because I wasn't with any of the people at High Country News anymore. I was kind of felt further and further away from that publication. So I emailed them, asked them if they needed more editing muscle, and yeah, just weaseled my way into sort of a full editor position there from issue 2 on. And that ended up being a really, really good decision. The magazine got more attention, was profiled in the Times about a year ago, and we now have more money. We can pay editors a little bit. And I should say The Drift is also a triannual publication of politics and culture. We do long, ideas-driven essays. And so once I sort of had more on my resume with The Drift, after a little bit, a job opened at Harper's, and they had remembered me from my old attempt to work there and had noticed the work at The Drift and were impressed by it and reached back out to me, and I went through the application process and became an associate editor there, and moved to New York. And it was kind of my pivot from trying to do more full-time writing to deciding to wanting to do editing full-time, which was partially wanting stability, wanting to have some time in New York at this point in my life, and wanting to just wanting to have the opportunity to do rigorous long-form reporting and get to work with really ambitious writers. So as an editor there, I edit I'm the main editor of this smaller front of book section called Annotation, and I edit features. So I'm editing a piece about sickle cell anemia in Nigeria and how it affects couples when they're deciding whether to get married or stay together and have kids. I'm editing a piece about Big Sky, Montana, and the hedge fund that sort of runs the town there. Editing a piece about the landless workers movement in Brazil. So it's a thrill to get to work with so many reporters, but to also have my hands on a lot of pots and go to the office and have colleagues and be on a team. But I also miss writing, and so I'm like in the midst of trying to figure out if I can do both of those things. But to your question about kind of transitioning from regional to national, I think the lessons that feel like they're forming in my head from what I've done so far were that both with my decision to go to High Country News and to reach out to The Drift in their early stages, felt like moments where I was trusting my taste in work, even though they weren't huge names or weren't, the sexiest publications ever or at the time. But trusting my intuition that I could do really rigorous work here and that I would have a role that was respected and I could shape the publication myself too. And those ended up being good investments. And I think in terms of the actual work at regional publications, it is just as creative and artful and investigative and rigorous as national work, often more so, honestly, because you have reporters on the ground who know how local news shapes issues in more nuanced ways, who know how to make really sharp interventions in a subject, who know the other reporters, who know how to carve out a really unique viewpoint in a story. And I think that national media can't, when you're scaling up, you cannot always keep that, which is kind of a tragic part of trying to go national, but you learn how to find a real grounded story. And I think Harper's is a publication that kind of especially retains that kind of on-the-ground reporting for a national audience. So that's me.
Thank you so much, Elena. Your point about T&J being scrappy feels like the exact perfect word to describe my experience of T&J, and Jesse is nodding, and I don't know about T&J history in the room, but yeah. Julia, you're at the Marshall Project now, but before that, you were at the New York Times for 2 decades covering immigration, United Nations, and before that, you were a correspondent in Mexico. In 1998, no big deal. You won a Pulitzer Prize for your reporting with some colleagues on drug corruption in Mexico. And since then, you've sort of continued to build such an accomplished body of work, furthering your work in Latin America and immigration, and as the longest career journalist on this panel, and
Delicately put.
and someone who broke out from campus journalism as part of the first class of women at Yale.
Class of 73, yes.
We would just love to tell, if you could tell us
The whole story?
how you did it.
I have 6 minutes here.
Yeah.
So I do want to take you back because to remind you what was going on when the New Journal was founded and where we were on the Yale campus, because I think it's important to understand both the evolution of the New Journal and my particular story, which was we were fully consumed with protests against the war in Vietnam. A Black Panther leader named Bobby Seale was on trial in the courthouse on the campus, and the student body was very much embroiled in the debate over the Black Panther Party and their position, and we were also the first class of incoming women. And so there was an environment there where there was already a very powerful sense of accountability journalism, the need for accountability journalism, that Yale University, and particularly the Yale Daily News, did not have the truth, that there were other truths out there that that journalists needed to capture. So that was the origin of my coming to journalism. I felt like I needed, there was another reality, there were other realities out there that I had some tools, and particularly having written for the New Journal, I knew that I could write, and I also knew that there were other people that could write, and there were people who could edit. And so kind of empowered by that understanding, I, at a certain point, not long after I graduated from Yale, moved to El Salvador in the middle of a civil war. And for the next 10 years, I lived in Central America, and I covered the civil war in El Salvador. There was a genocide going on in Guatemala. There was the revolution and counter-revolution in Nicaragua, which consumed most of that period. So this was 10 years of my life when I was pretty regularly in covering combat and in a war situation. And so I learned a few things from this. One, my first gig in Central America was actually for National Public Radio. I was a radio correspondent. And so throughout my career, I've had the privilege of having more than one media, which I think is something very important today. And I learned I learned from that how to tell stories in different ways, because there are different ways to tell stories for the radio than for print. But from the beginning, I had that privilege of having different media. I learned that journalism is an apprentice occupation. You have to learn it from the people that know how to do it, the great journalists. And fortunately, there were a lot of great journalists who came to Central America to report on those wars. I learned that when you start out, you have to just do whatever you can do. I went to El Salvador to go where the story was, and then once you're in the story, you have to be willing to learn from the people who know how to cover the story. And you have to be humble about that. You can't assume that you know a lot, even though you graduated from Yale and you've written these long-form pieces. No, you have to really be willing to watch and listen and learn. You have to be ready to work in a team, even though it's very competitive. You have to be willing to work in a team. And you have to learn at a very early stage a couple of things. One is the value of accuracy. If you make a mistake, if your journalism makes a mistake in a war situation, it's very dangerous. You have the potential, you can get yourself killed, you can get somebody else killed. And so accurate journalism, the value of rigorous fact-finding is something that I learned when I was in Central America. I also learned something that I put in the category of don't do stupid things. And I will say, my generation in Central America was the first generation of where there were a lot of women in the field. And I will say that my women colleagues were faster to learn in that particular category than some of my men colleagues. By don't do stupid things, I mean, don't go out in the field until you know what the story is. Don't go by yourself. Don't go down that road if you don't know what's on the road. Just, your job is to get to the place where the person can tell you the story and listen to that story, understand that story, and get back safely and file it to your editor. I learned also the value of giving an editor what they want, when they want it, at the space they want it. That's a wonderful discipline that I think everyone who's a journalist could benefit from that. Just the basic discipline. I know long form is good, but in a way, long form is something that you should earn, I think, in a certain way. You learn how to report accurately, concisely, at a certain word length, on time. These are very valuable skills that I was able to learn in Central America. The other thing that I learned in Central America was where is journalism's place? How to take a distance from the ideological confrontation, because there was a very intense ideological confrontation going on at that time. And it was a constant battle to kind of find the place for a journalist to be. Because it was a Cold War confrontation, and so you had, Marxist revolutionaries on one hand, you had the Sandinistas, who had overthrown this loathsome American-backed dictator. There was a lot of support, and the principles that the Sandinistas fought for, there was a lot of admiration for that. You had the Reagan administration that was telling all kinds of lies about what was going on in Central America. So there was this incredibly intense conflict, and just finding the space for fact-finding journalism was very important to do, and I learned a lot about that from being in Central America. Anyway, I will not go on in great detail about this. After Central America, and I will say for the women in the room, I left Central America in 1990 because I became pregnant. And part of this is, you have to make some very tough decisions along the way about now what do I want to do in this phase of my life? What's my next right? Yeah, so, and that was the some of the biggest stories of my 10 years in Central America happened while I was, right after I found out I was pregnant. So I had to make a very tough decision there, which I have not regretted for a single day. My daughter is thriving. She's 32 years old, happily married. She has a wonderful career. Best decision I ever made. So in 1995, I went from, at that point, in Central America, went Baltimore Sun, Boston Globe, Washington Post. And in 1995, I was hired by the New York Times. And I went to Mexico, and again, this is a, it turned out to be a very dangerous beat for a number of reasons, but teamwork, skepticism, skeptical reporting, accountable reporting, figuring out how to use sources safely in an environment like that where people who are on the front lines dealing with situations of police corruption and narco trafficking, those people are really at risk. And learning how to develop sources so that they trust you and they know you're not going to put them at risk. This is another thing that I learned along the way, and it was a very valuable experience in Mexico. And then after we finished our work in Mexico, I came back, wrote a book about Mexico, and then in 2006, the New York Times offered me, or rather I would say, I wrote a memo to Jill Abramson, who was not yet the executive editor, she was managing editor at that point, about the immigration beat and why the New York Times needed a dedicated national traveling correspondent for immigration. And I listed my first 5 stories, and they gave me the beat, and I wrote the stories. And so the beat that I fashioned for the Times about immigration was a beat that looked at national policy, the policy that was coming out of Washington, and looked at its impact on local, its on-the-ground impact. And so I ended up reporting at Postville, Iowa, where there was an enormous immigration raid, Hidalgo, Texas, where people were coming across the border. I'm proud to say that I wrote the first story in a major publication in 2014 identifying the fact that people were coming across the border and seeking asylum, that the asylum system was going to become the major vehicle of immigration across the border, which I rest my case. That's still happening today. And so, I wrote a story about visas at Disney World, which made me the darling of the right because, and at one point I was getting like, Breitbart was calling me and Fox News wanted to put me on television because I wrote this story about how Disney was abusing visas to fire American workers, which was this was before Trump, but this was the sort of the water that Trump was swimming in at that point. Anyway, so that's I'm kind of condensing it, but what are the few things that I learned? You make yourself indispensable because of your knowledge of your subject. You develop some kind of knowledge of your subject so that you, at a certain point to an editor, you become indispensable. You become the person who has to write that story. You're a storyteller. You're telling stories. You have to find the story. It's not the subject. You're always looking for the story. And in order to get the story, you have to listen. You have to find the people, and then you have to listen to them. Journalism is not about you, or the type of journalism that I practice is not about me. It's about listening to people. And you have to, in my view, it's very important as a principle of fact-finding to not be engaged, to find a space that is not is not informed by ideology. You really have to have to practice the kind of journalism that I believe in, you have to have a clear-eyed view of that you are looking for a series of facts that you don't have. and that somebody is going to give you because you listened to them and you did your reporting. And I also learned, and I think this is true today, and hopefully this will be useful to you, which is something that you were talking about, which is one of the advantages that journalists have today, which is that there's no big story that's limited to a certain geography or a certain publication. There are big stories everywhere now, and you can get out there and get them, and you have a possibility now to tell those stories in a way that in a certain way didn't exist when we were coming up. So, you know, those are the lessons that I've learned. The stories are everywhere. The journalists need to be both tenacious and aggressive and humble. There's a certain kind of humility that is involved in good journalism, which is the humility to listen to what people are saying. And this wasn't the subject of this panel, but there's a debate going on in our profession these days, which I thought I would raise, which is the whole debate about objectivity and neutrality and impartiality. And this debate is being waged by two former executive editors of the Washington Post, Len Downey, who's down in Arizona, who published a recent report, which I commend everybody in this room, about the whole question of objectivity in journalism. And now, most recently, Marty Baron, who was weighed in, and I don't know if you've seen this, but he has this manifesto that was published in the Washington Post not long ago. And so one of the things that Marty says is, he says, the idea is to be open-minded when we begin our research, and to do that work as conscientiously as possible. It demands a willingness to listen, an eagerness to learn, and an awareness that there is much more for us to know. So let's do that journalism. You know, that's the journalism that that we learned at the New Journal, and let's keep doing that journalism.
Thank you so much to all of you, all of our panelists. We are unfortunately running low on time, but we want to pass the mic over to Ray Lipstein to ask the last question. Ray is a senior web producer at The New Yorker and has written on subjects like film criticism, coffee connoisseurs, COVID beards, tax hikes. So off to you, Ray.
Well, thank you so much for all of these wonderful histories, and I am in this unhumble position of asking, I guess, the only question we'll get to ask. So feel free to answer something that seems more interesting to you. But I am curious about speaking about protecting sources, speaking about even if you're reporting from a place of a non-ideological view, there's obviously political ramifications of the things we talk about. Julia, you mentioned having an unintended ideological pickup of one of your pieces. I'm curious how you have any illustrative examples of times you've had to compromise, cases where you were things that you felt were deal breakers, or situations where you did not knew in you had to be strategic, or for expediency's sake had to make certain agreements or concessions. And from a writing perspective or an editing perspective, if anything jumps out at you, because one of my takeaways leaving college was, you're not really given the skill of learning how to compromise that much at Yale often, and that has been my experience in the greater world. So, if anyone has thoughts on that, and thanks again to everyone for organizing.
We in accountability or investigative reporting, right? A lot of the way you deal with your sources kind of depends on who your sources are. Like, if somebody is an executive at a major corporation or a government official. They have handlers. They know how the game is played, right? So if they tell you something that they shouldn't have told you, and then they're like, it's off the record later, you're like, too bad, buddy. But the main thing that we learned, and in talking to regular people, I remember reading this in, if you guys are not, those of you who do accountability journalism, if you're not members of investigative reporters and editors, I encourage you to join, because they teach you a lot of skills. And one of them was that you treat regular people not the way you'd want to be treated, people you're talking to, but the way you'd want your parents to be treated. You know, your parents who are teachers or engineers or doctors or, like work in a store or something, people who are not used to dealing with the press, and you give them that grace, right? And it is about, and it's not just like not providing names, it's also thinking about, so those are sometimes when compromises have to be made, right? Sometimes when people give you things and somebody is in a room and like say they're the only woman in the room, right? And you say a source said something and then you're like, and then you refer to them with the pronoun she later and everybody knows it's that person. So you actually have to be ahead of your subjects to understand how to protect them because they are not sophisticated with the media. And I think mainly the compromises that we make is that we know a lot of things in our gut or things that are on background and we can't use them. But the great thing about accountability work is that you stand on other people's shoulders and you do groundwork that other people will build on. And so it's okay. You've done that work, somebody else will come at it and maybe you can come at it later. You don't have to do everything with just one story. So that's kind of how I live with certain compromise. I don't feel like I've made ethical compromises, but I do feel like I treat people differently based on who they are. And the fact is, it's kind of like what Julia was saying about humility. Like, no one owes you their time or their stories. Nobody, right? This is a gift that they're giving you. And you need to treat it that way.
I would just, I've had the privilege of working for the great American newspapers, and if you got the story, they back you up. I'm just, I'm thinking about compromise. The Disney story that I mentioned, Bob Iger, who is the was the CEO of Disney and is again the CEO of Disney, for years had this hatchet woman who was his, VP for communications named Xenia Mucha. And Disney, I have to tell you that Disney is like a company town in Orlando. I had to meet the sources for this story. These were American citizens who were tech workers at Disney World in Orlando. I had to meet them in like 20 miles away in the back of a Barnes and Noble in the shopping mall. They were like looking around like this to see if Disney had sent some spy out to follow them and make sure that they could never get a job again in Orlando, Florida. I mean, and once Disney got wind that I was going to publish this story, Bob Iger called Dean Baquet, who was the editor of the paper. Xenia Mucha started doing all this reporting and calling my editors and telling them that I was a corrupt person. I'll tell you that the editors at the Times got really worried about this. Disney was saying, this is not a story, this is not true, we didn't do this. And there were delays, and I argued, and I had to go in more than once and say, no, this is what's going on here. And so they don't make it easy sometimes, the editors at the Times, and I had a few experiences at the Washington Post. Sometimes they didn't make it easy, but they always published the story. In the end, that story was published. It got 1.5 million page views on the first day, which was a big deal back then. This was several years ago. People canceled their reservations for vacations at Disney World, and I think that this story had a major impact. Disney never did that particular conduct again. And so, have I had to compromise? I had to sometimes fight to be sure if my reporting wasn't solid, I was going to be in extremely deep, trouble. If my reporting was solid, I had to make the argument, and these great newspapers published those stories. And so hopefully, even in these hard times, even when the business model is in doubt, let's make sure we keep that tradition of journalism. We're not making those compromises.
I'm not sure if anyone else has anything to say. Okay, we actually have 15 more minutes, so I think we have time to open it up to the audience for questions. I don't know if we have someone who's carrying the microphone. Okay, amazing. Yeah, does anyone have a question?
Over
Yeah,
there.
Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Laskow. Since you guys are talking about like early career stuff and transferring, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like bad jobs or bad bosses or bad editors. Like,
You mean like crying in the bathroom bad?
Yeah.
Yes.
Like as you're building your career, sometimes you get in bad situations, right? Like how
Yeah.
do you know what a bad situation is and when to leave it, even if it feels like it's maybe like not a great career move? Sounds like Neela maybe has.
Oh,
story.
yeah. So the great thing about working at some bureaus is like there's not a lot of women. So if you go to the one of the few great things about there not being a lot of women is you can have privacy when you go cry in the bathroom, or you call your best friend Tina Kelly who brought you into journalism and just rage at her for 15 minutes about why you have this job. Yes. So. It's been really interesting because I have a very good friend who has who's going to start at the Washington Post, and she came from a rather prestigious job before. And I'm also in charge of, or I've been on a lot of hiring panels at NPR recently, mainly because they have so few editors of color at my level that that I'm always on these hiring panels. But one of the things I've seen is that it's very easy if you start at a prestigious place to get locked in because the prestige matters so much, right? You tell people in Washington that you work for the Washington Post or the Times or Axios or whatever, and all of a sudden people kind of know who you are, or you get this sort of social license and access, right? And I think it's really what's really hard is leaving that. It's leaving that and being somebody different, or leaving that and like a lot of us who do climate know high country news, but your mom's friends might not, right? And so it's that kind of thing that makes it hard. And I think what's difficult is like getting up every morning and dreading going to work. And you really have to do this gut check about like how you're feeling, and it's really, really bad for you. I mean, I've seen it not just in myself but in other colleagues. And I think when you're in a bad situation, you have to know that at the end of the day, you don't have to be at a big prestigious place to do really fine journalism, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is, if your current boss is terrible, this is one thing I wanted to say because people gave really good advice, but I only learned in my 50s that I need mentors, right? And I need many mentors. So if you're not finding that with your one editor, your coworkers, find others at the publication you are at and elsewhere outside, because they will be the people who'll tell you about other jobs and who'll put in a good word for you and things like that. And understand that it will take you time to leave that job, but you will. And journalism is tumultuous, and NPR just laid off 10% of its workforce, right? I mean, but but there are opportunities for you there, and the main thing is you will do your best work when you're happy. Like now as a manager, like my main thing is that my reporters are like happy, because when they're happy, then they're ambitious and they do really good work. So so that's what I would say is like find support, find mentors, understand that it's going to take you time to get out of there, and don't get like into these sort of golden handcuffs where you're working at a prestigious place and you feel like that's the only place where you can do work, where you can win prizes, where you can have impact, because it's not. And you'll make your way and you'll do really fine work. Nobody else has ever cried in a bathroom? I can't believe this.
Yes.
It's all ahead of you.
Hi. My question's for Maya, but it builds on Julia's remarks. You're covering in a country now with quite an authoritarian president that's also pretty dangerous for journalists. Just what's it like working in Mexico now?
Well, I think the question of Mexico being a dangerous place for journalists is not exclusive to this presidency, right? There's a much longer history of it being a violent country. I think it's a little bit strange sometimes to address this question working in the international media because we are slightly more immune. One, because of like the privilege of being able to get on a plane and leave if you're in a bad situation, which I know people who have. And the other is that the things that get people, I think, into really perilous moments in their lives have a lot to do with doing very real accountability journalism at a local level, where they are calling out corruption in the local government or where they have to write about local crime, and nobody is going in to protect them. And also working at publications with very, very little funding, right? The average salary for a journalist in Mexico, for many of my friends even who have spent 10 years working as journalists, is very, very small. And I think that that comes with all kinds of safety constraints. And there are some efforts, I think, one, to build solidarity, to have regional networks, to have national networks for freelancers or for other people who work along with you, or other organizations that come in and try to get people to go to a different country if they know they're being threatened. Given that there is a federal protection where police will, or police-like entities will check in on you to see if you're okay, and there will be panic buttons that are supposed to work, and those have all failed, right? There are circumstances of journalists who have been killed in the last year who had panic buttons or who tried to enter into the protection mechanism and it didn't work. So I think one is just working in the international media is recognizing that there should be some obligations to the rest of your colleagues to be helpful in whatever way you can. And obviously, I don't think that any one of us can know when we have colleagues who are at many different parts of the country, but I think sometimes media is a little bit hermetic and you try to work only with your colleagues and for the benefit of your publication, and that's a little bit silly, especially at a time when it's so dangerous. And I think we owe it to other people. And there's also, I worked as a freelancer for a long time, and there's so many freelancers. And there's a big effort to try to make sure that the treatment to someone who is, let's say, from the US, like myself, working in Mexico would be the same as for someone who is Mexican working in the place, and that there's not a difference in wages or in the title someone is given if they work on a shoot or something like that. And that can partly come from, people who, like myself, are from a place like the US and so already have a pedestal off of which to then press internally at wherever you're working, or externally or on social media for a kind of greater holding to account, and trying to be helpful to other people when they get stuck. I don't think, there's complaints. The complaints about the Mexican president have a lot to do with not responding well enough to assassinations of journalists and not creating an adequate mechanism and not addressing the ways that that's historically also for political reasons. And, you can think with some amount of dread there's an election next year, and that will necessarily in Mexico imply more violence, whether that's against political actors or against the press covering them. And so it's very unfortunate, but I do feel like the media landscape in which we work now necessitates publications not really sticking to themselves only, but a kind of willingness to, in all the different ways, financial or otherwise, make sure that we're watching out for colleagues. And I'm very grateful to have had a large chunk of time not working at a large publication to try to understand that better. And it's a work in progress.
Hi, I'm Eli Kintish. I'm one of the few video journalists in the room, so if you're in video, please come introduce yourself. We can chat. I'm interested what the panel thinks about perseverance, because perseverance in journalism, I somehow picked up later at Yale. It felt like all these opportunities were kind of available.
Sorry. Julia, I feel like you and I are the ones who...
Yeah, go ahead.
We persevered. We persevered. I still have a job. So, yeah, I think, you know, I've seen a lot of people, given the tumult in our industry, who have left, and some of them are in PR, some of them are teaching, some of them are doing other things, and I feel like people who've remained in journalism, a lot of it is luck. A lot of it is having particular skills, like languages or a body of knowledge, specialization in certain things like business or science or like a policy issue or something like that. But a lot of it, you know, a lot of it is luck. And I think a lot of times when people opt to do other things, it's entirely understandable. I mean, I felt like I didn't really know how to do anything else, right? So I took a buyout from the New York Times in 2008 because they were doing buyouts then, and they and you know, you get to the New York Times and you're just like, wow, I'm at the pinnacle of my career. I'm going to retire here, and you realize that you're not. And one of the things was so interesting because like you're writing about industries that are cutting back, like the auto industry, and you realize you are now one of those industries, right? And you're going to go through a lot of shocks, like any other industry does, and it's unnerving. And so you also get your identity tied up with things like, you know, you go to a dinner party and, you know, what do you do? Oh, I'm a New York Times reporter, right? And I was like, I'm not one of those people. And then I realized I was one of those people, you know? And so it was hard. And I freelanced and I did long form, which paid nothing, but it was really good to do. But then I had all these experiences that felt entirely random, like being a foreign correspondent, you know, covering faith, like just all of this stuff, but somehow it was made, somebody saw the value to it. And that was when I went to the LA Times, because frankly, like being you know, having a family and being a freelancer in DC was just like financially untenable, right? And so they're the ones who hired me. And, you know, but I think in hindsight, I did get lucky. And really, if nothing else, please, I did not know this as a 20-year-old or 21-year-old when I was at Yale. Please get yourself a kitchen cabinet of mentors. You know, like I learned this from my friend who's like 31, right? And who I saw do this, because they're the people who will tell you about jobs, tell you about opportunities, help you persevere, help you get through things. So don't feel like you have to do this alone, or that if you don't do it, it's somehow your personal failure. Like our industry is a mess and will continue to be a mess because of you know, revenue models, but it's also that, you know, you find, people will tell you about jobs, including people who might not have a job, because they want you to succeed. That notion of that we're not in this together, right? I mean, we're not in this alone, that we're in this together, whether it's in an outpost somewhere where there's a lot of violence, or whether it's, you know, in a major media hub. People are really rooting for one another. So I would recommend that you do that you talk to people, you network, and that'll help you find your way. And if you decide to do something else, you know, none of this has been in vain, right? Oh, and the final thing I will say too is that I've found friends who've left journalism to do things like PR for some, you know, advocacy groups, but then they found their way back into journalism. And I think there's a lot more, there's a lot more understanding of that than there would have been years ago when people were like, well, you've left to do PR, and now you can't be a journalist again, because people understand what great pressures we face. So, yeah. I have to applaud after every answer.
Step in. This has been absolutely wonderful. Jesse and I made an arrangement, which is, since he doesn't wear a watch, I'll wear one. Was that so? We're exactly at the right moment to be stopping. I want to say two things quickly, and then we will have coffee down the way. I believe in that far room. I'll say one other thing. If I had a favorite exchange, it was Sarah Laskow, science editor of The Atlantic, saying, "What's a bad job?" and Neela Banerjee saying, "It's the golden handcuffs one." Right? It's the one in which...
No, that's not true. It's just that it's hard to see something as a bad job when it's a prestigious place.
Yeah. And then Elena Saavedra Buckley giving us the term scrappy. as an aspiration and not and a marker of excellence. So in any event, there will be. I believe there's coffee and food. I also wanted to say, the people who are serving you breakfast, for example, that would be Zach Gross, are so much people you will look back on this event and think, I met Zach Gross. He wrote When Yale Harbored a Nazi. He gave me breakfast at the New Journal gathering, and I wanted to introduce you. The person, would you continue, Doreen, just pointing to Zach? The person pointing the finger at Zach right now from above is Doreen Chernecki, who wrote the cover article, which was Sex Work in New Haven, a brilliantly reported work by Doreen. And Doreen is also the person who can give you a tote bag. Designed by wonderful Kevin Chen, the editor, and the designer, and Doreen. So you have two choices: coffee down the way, Doreen with tote bags. I really recommend Doreen as a first stop.